Hi friends, welcome back. This is Art Class 2's Repeated Sweets project. This is lesson 4. You should be watching these lessons in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, and here we are at the end of our project. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. We're focusing on painting in the style of the American pop artist Wayne Thiebaud. And so let me review for you what you need as we finish up our project today. You're going to need, of course, your project from where we were, with just some basic colors laid in from lesson 3. You'll need some waxy coated paper plates to use as your palettes, a clean bowl of water, a watercolor set of pan watercolors, at least 8, I have 16 here, and some round brushes, several sizes. You'll need some paper towel for cleaning off your brushes. And make sure your surface is protected by some old newspaper or newsprint that we're going to be painting on. All right, awesome. Now we've talked about Wayne Thiebaud, the great artist. I want to show you a picture of him because he's still alive today and he's living in San Francisco. And you know, he paints right up to today, which is pretty amazing. It shows you that when God makes you a creative individual, you can be creating no matter what ages. And that's why I love having my young friends like you learn how to be better artists through these art classes. So as part of our pop art project, we have selected in the style of Wayne Thiebaud some type of treat or sweet. And so it could be a cupcake, an ice cream cone, a popsicle, a slice of pie, a donut. And whatever you chose as your motif, we're repeating it because repetition was a big part of the pop art style, and specifically Wayne Thiebaud. And we also know that we wanted to make it mostly the same, but a little bit different so that there's variety and interesting appeal for whoever's looking at it. And so we've come so far as to we're ready to put in some detail, and I'm really excited about that. We've laid in a flat wash that we have as our background, and perhaps some of you have put in a graded wash where it goes from dark to light. And so now I'm ready to go on. Aren't you excited? It's going to be yummy fun. All right, so here's how we're going to start. Your sweets painting should be dry from our last lesson where we had our base colors that were pale, that were the same, all finished. And now I'm ready to put in the detail, specifically the shadows too. And of course we talked about the importance of knowing where our light source was coming from. So I want to get all the basics in before I work on the real fine details, and so you can see there's this space in between the frosting and the cake cup that has batter that I need to put that in. So let's start with that. So because it's a small space, I'm going to be using a small brush. And I'm going to start by pouring just a very tiny bit of water on my palette. And it's going to be kind of a yellowish color. Let's just assume that it's kind of like yellow cake. So remember, you load your brush by laying your brush on its side and gently rolling it. And I'm going to go back to my puddle. I want it to be a little bit darker than that. And now I'll use my thin brush to fill in this spot. And I'll do that on all 3. Okay. And that shouldn't take too long. So if you have any other areas, not details, but just areas that you didn't get to finish because of the idea of not doing wet paint where there's already wet paint, then do that now. Okay. I still want to be careful where I put my brush. I don't want to be sloppy and go over where I've already painted. And that's because the water in this wet paint we just laid will attract the pigment out of where we had already painted. So you might get a tiny bit of bleeding, and that's okay. A tiny bit is fine. Now I want to move on to an area that's also surrounded by dry, and that would be my cherry. But I know that cherry isn't very pale. It's that rich dark color. You can see it right here on this cupcake. Look at how dark that cherry is, right? Intense red. So I won't make a puddle. I'll simply check that my brush is clean. And now I'm going to go right to the deep red and fill in my cherry, but I will not fill in that little rectangle of the highlight. I want to be very careful because that's supposed to stay white. I will do all 3 cherries. And I'm going down, overlapping just a tiny bit where that frosting was. Oh, looks yummy to eat already. I'm going to wash out my brush. Now while that's drying, I can move on to an area where I want to have some more detail. Because right now, these cupcakes look pretty flat, and we know they're not. We know they have lots of dimension and texture. So it goes back to the idea of knowing where your light source is coming from. We made that decision when we did our drawing. The light is coming from my right, casting a shadow to the left. That's why the highlight on the cherries is on the right-hand side. So I want to use the principle of value and shade and shadow because these nice rounded cupcakes, right? A cupcake is round, it's not flat. And so as the light moves across the surface of a rounded object, it'll go from light to dark. So the lines I made for the fluting of the cupcake are kind of my key. So I want to use that same color that I used in the bottom. You're going to do that with whatever color you chose for your treat. If it's a rounded object like a donut that goes around or a cupcake that goes around or even the scoop of ice cream, right? It's going to be lighter on one side and darker on the other. So the principle we're going to use for watercolors is this. The drier the brush, the darker the color. The more water on the brush, the paler the color. So I'm not going to make a puddle. I'm simply going to go into my water, go right to the pan. Remember what color I used for this bottom. I used orange. And I'm going to roll my brush. And I'm going to start on this darker side. And I'm going to make what look like stripes for that fluting, right? Just down like this. And you'll notice the color is getting lighter as I go. And then I'm going to just stop. So it's light on this side, dark on that side. Now I'm going to move to the next one. Dip my brush. I don't want a lot of water, just a little bit of water. Roll to load. This is the same color that I used when it was pale. But now it's darker because my brush is drier. It's wet, but it's drier than it was. And I'm making those lines, but I'm not going all the way across. So there's a change in value from that cup, from light to dark. And the last one. Now, supposing you don't have a fluted cupcake bottom, well, then you're going to just make solid like a graded wash, but in reverse. Graded wash, dark to light. So your objects will be darker on the side where the shadows are cast. Okay? Now, the cool thing about watercolor is you can do a lot of techniques just with the brush. So I'm going to rinse out my brush. I'm actually going to dry it a little bit on my paper towel. I'm not going into my pans. And I'm going to use the side of my brush and kind of just blend it in so it doesn't look so stripy like this. And you can see how it's light to dark on that side. Okay, I'm going to let that dry for a little bit before I try anything else. But what about the frosting? Well, you've probably frosted a cake or a cupcake. It's not flat. It's got a lot of texture. And the way you show texture is to use value, light against dark. So do you remember the colors you chose for where it was different? Maybe you have a frosted donut. You want to do the same type of thing. I'm going to clean off my brush. And I know I used the brown for this chocolate. So I'm going to go right into my brown pan, load my brush by twirling it on its side. And again, darker on this one side, I'm going to put in, and I'm not going to be really straight. I'm just going to kind of wiggle my brush around to get kind of different texture. And then I'm going to, before I get to the light side, I'm just going to pick it up. So you see how it's darker on that side. I'm creating texture and value at the same time. I think I'm going to leave it like that. Wash out my brush. And now I need to go to this pistachio green color. It could be mint. Maybe it's mint frosting. What would you want it to be? So that's this light green, not too much water. Load my brush. And again, I want to concentrate on the side that's in shadow. And I'm going to kind of swirl my brush around, making some different textures. And then when I get to kind of a little more than halfway, I'm going to pick it up. Now, I don't think that has enough dark definition in it to really see it. So here's where my knowledge of the color wheel comes in handy. In Art Lesson 1, we talked about the color wheel and knowing what colors are next to each other on the color wheel. So this is like a yellow-green. So I think I'm just going to use straight green. Just a little bit of straight green. And go in here so I can just get some more darker variety. And then when I come around to the middle on the light side, I'm going to lift my brush. So it's going from dark over here to light. Got it? Now, did you notice over here that my frosting has dripped down into my cake? Two things you can do. One, you can just leave it. The frosting will do that. And it's watercolor. Or you can take a small piece of paper towel and blot it up like an eraser. Now I'm ready to go on to this frosting over here that's kind of like a rich berry type. And that was my purplish red pan. I need to clean my brush. Not too much water. I'm going into this purplish red pan. Load my brush. And start on this side. Remember, you know, the dark side is always the same for all three. The light source is the same for all three. And I'm going to kind of swirl my brush around to kind of get some of that bumpy texture. And then as I move across, I start to lift up my brush. There we go. So the light is coming from the right, causing the left side of the cupcake bottom and the left side of the frosting to appear darker. Now what about our cherry? Well, that's the same thing. But we already have a dark color, so how do we do that? Well, you're going to take your smallest brush and you're going to actually keep it really dry. Okay, so you're going to take off a lot of the water off the edge of the bowl and just dip the point into the red. And make some thicker, darker blobs of red cherry on that left side. Be careful not to touch the frosting or the color will bleed. There we go. Well, we're not done yet, friends. We still have to do probably the most important thing that makes it look like Wayne Thiebaud, and that's the shadows. But this side is wet. So we can't really work on that side yet because the shadows must be precise. So let me talk with you a little bit about a Wayne Thiebaud painting while we're waiting for this to dry. Let's look at Wayne Thiebaud's painting of cakes in a cake window. This is called 7 Cakes Cake Window. Now notice how strong the shadows are. The shadow is a motif. And so he repeats not only these round cakes in the window and the plates they're on, but also the shadow of the cake stand and the cake. Strong shape, dark shape, consistent throughout. And the shadow will always be the darkest thing in the painting. We have to remember our rule about watercolors, that the drier the brush, the darker and deeper the color. The wetter the brush, the paler the color. That's why you make a puddle when you're doing a wash when it's going to be pale, but you can go straight to your pan with a wet brush when you need more intense color. So it's time for us to work on our shadows. So check first to make sure that it's dry where you're going to do the shadows. This still has a little bit of drying to do, but I can talk about how you're going to get ready because I need a lot of paint. And this is purple, And I remember the pan that I used, what purple pan I used, and I want it to be a nice, deep, intense color. So I can work away from where the paint is already wet. I'm not going to create a puddle. Actually, you know what? I'm going to use clean water. So you go get some clean water, rinse out your bowl, get some clean water. And this is going to be the darkest thing on your composition. So whatever was your original wash color, you'll now use for your shadow color. So mine is this straight violet purple. I wet my brush, I load my brush, and you're going to take your time. Now, a lot of times in watercolor, you can work quickly, like with a wash, or not worry when you go outside the lines, like with the frosting. But with the shadow, you have to be very precise. So I'm going to make a nice dark purple, and I'm going to take my time to get my line nice and crisp. Go back into your pan if you need to. You want this to be nice and dark. So don't dip into your water very much. You want the color to be nice and dark and even. I'm being very careful that I'm not up against wet paint. Use the smallest brush you have, my friends. You can always fill in the shadow with a bigger brush, but when you're doing the really careful shape, because it's very important, we're trying to emulate Wayne Thiebaud. His shapes were such a prominent motif in his work that I'm being very careful that my shape of my shadow is accurate. Now I'm going to move on. I just need a little bit of water to make sure I get the brush wet enough. I'm going to move on to my second shadow. You notice I'm being very careful where I place my fingers and my hands. You might not realize it that you get some watercolor on you and you have to be very careful. So don't handle your painting a lot. Be very careful that when you're touching it. Now this shadow is behind that other cupcake because of the shadow is cast behind the cupcake, so it wouldn't go on the cupcake. It's on the surface of the table. That's where the shadow actually is, on the surface of the table. And we're just trying to show the shadow. Taking my time. It's worth taking your time, friends, on a project that you want done well. I'm sure you know that from schoolwork, from other things. It's worth it. Maybe you like to cook. Read the recipe carefully, measure carefully, do all your prep work. We talked about the importance of preparation. And now, this stage, we will really want to take our time and get our shadow shape just right. Now, of course, the shadow has to be attached to the item that's casting the shadow. And now we're ready for our last one. Careful that I'm up against dry paint. It's still a little wet over there, so I'm going to avoid that for right now. Work over here. Now, what if you have some small details like sprinkles on a donut or other things like that? Well, hopefully when you were painting, you went around them. And now you can add in all those special details that make your repeated sweets so unique. Now see, it's still wet there at the top. You can see it's shiny. That means it's wet. So I'm going to be very careful. Using just the very tip of my brush, I'm going to go as close as I can, but really make sure that I don't cause the one color to bleed into the other color. Of course, my friends, if it does, it's not a tragedy. First of all, watercolors are meant to kind of have that overlapped, translucent look. Do they almost look good enough to eat? You know, I went to a Wayne Thiebaud exhibit here in California, and I got to see Wayne Thiebaud's paintings really up close. And that oil paint looked like frosting. They looked good enough to eat. I loved looking at all the details that he put in. You might not see it all in the camera or in an art book, but it's amazing. Now, I still feel like this needs something, some greater level of detail or more texture, but it's still wet. Well, what I can do, friends, is I can add in, for shadow, the opposite on the color wheel. If you remember from Art Class 1, we talked about the importance of knowing your color wheel and what are the complementary colors or the opposites. So for example, red is the opposite of green on the color wheel. Yellow is the opposite of purple. And blue is the opposite of orange. Well, since I know that these cake cups are orange and I want to create even more shadows, I'm going to use blue because it's the complementary color. So to do that, I'm going to take a little bit of water on a new paper plate or a separate area of my palette, just a tiny bit. There we go. And I'm going to use a blue. So I'm going to load my brush with a little bit of blue and go to my puddle, because I don't want this to be intense. That's kind of intense, isn't it? So I'm going to water that down. Remember, the more water, the paler the color. So I'm going to use my fine brush in this blue puddle here, just a little bit. And I'm actually going to go back and do the same type of thing of like stripes with blue, with the orange, just a few. And that creates even more shadow because blue is the complement of orange. So whatever the opposite on the color wheel. So if you did red, something with red, and you want to add in a shadow that's even deeper, use green, because that's the opposite on the color wheel. These are starting to look yummy. I'm getting hungry. How about you? Awesome. I think that looks fabulous. So we're just about finished, friends. All you have to do now is wait until it dries and, of course, clean out your brushes and all of your supplies. Now, it's really important that you want your watercolor pans and your brushes to last a long time so that you can do a lot more art projects. And so careful cleaning and care of your materials is important. So never store your brushes bristle side down in a cup. That will ruin them. You always clean your brushes really well. Now you can go and put them under running water. That actually rinses them better when you know you're all finished. Dry them off with paper towel and store them flat, okay? Don't store them standing up in a cup. As far as your paints, we never want to mix one color into another because you don't know who's going to use them next and you want to make sure you have pigment. So here's what I recommend you do. When you know you're finished, you take some paper towel and you actually lay it down into your palette and soak up any water that's in your pans. And you don't want to mix any colors, right? You want to make sure it's clean. But those are all fairly dry now. And if there's any paint that's splattered on the edges, take the time to take some paper towel that's moistened and wipe around it so that they're clean. Keep the lid on and store these flat as well so that they're ready for the next time. You know, Wayne Thiebaud didn't just do treats. He actually did a lot of things. He did portraits and figures, and he did beautiful California landscapes. Because after a while of doing his repeated suites, which he was famous for and he really enjoyed doing, he was ready for something new. And he knew that there was a lot he could learn from trying something new. I'm sure you've learned that too. Take a look at this Wayne Thiebaud painting, Flatland River, from 1997. Now, he painted this when he was 77 years old. That's incredible. And it's a bird's eye view of a river going through trees and fields. But you'll notice it has striking features that are also seen in all of his suites paintings. Repetition, strong shadows, intense color. Now, it's nice to see a change in the subject matter. Wayne Thiebaud felt that he could learn from something new, and he felt like people would enjoy seeing something new. And at the age of 77, for him to try something new, I think that's amazing. You know, it reminds me of a Bible verse that I have here in Ephesians. Let me find it for you. It talks about how we are made new when we follow after Jesus. We're new creatures. That's kind of hard to think of, isn't it? But we had our old self that did probably some things we were not supposed to, or had old habits or sin. But here in Ephesians 4, it says in verse 22, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off the old self, which is being corrupted by deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. See, we don't have to stay stuck in old habits or old ways of doing things. We can become new. That's what Wayne Thiebaud did. He decided to try something other than repeated sweets, and he has such an amazing collection of artwork, all kinds of subject matter that he tried throughout the years, and even now he's still painting. We can always learn something new. I love that verse. Well, I hope you had a great time doing our project of repeated sweets. Does yours look good enough to eat? I bet it looks different from the person next to you, too, if someone's working alongside you. It's exciting to see what you can do when you spend the time, when you prepare, when you learn the techniques of how to work with watercolor. So don't just stop here, my friends. Take another treat that you like and do another one so that you can repeat your repeated sweet. Well, I've had a lot of fun. I hope you had too. I'll see you for the next project on Art Class 2.